Hello, my name's David and I work for Firestone Books. We create books including Jekyll and Hyde in a variety of editions, including large print, extra large print and dyslexia-friendly editions. We also have something new or newish called annotation-friendly editions. And what they are books with extra space between the lines and round the margins and with extra blank pages at the end of each chapter, all for note-taking, so that you can annotate to your heart's content. And it will hopefully help improve your marks if you're studying at English GCSE. So please do check out the links below. And yeah, that's the end of the advert. So, to the video. When it comes to looking at the life of Robert Louis Stevenson, we don't really need to know about his whole life. We just need to know about those parts that led to the writing of Jekyll and Hyde. So, Robert Louis Stevenson was born in 1850 in Edinburgh. He was a sickly child, and so he often missed school due to his illness and often had to be educated at home. And indeed, during his relatively short life, he died at the age of 44. He was blighted by ill health, and he even wrote Jekyll and Hyde while suffering from a fever. Now, despite his ill health, he did make it to university. But to the dismay of his parents, he didn't seem that interested in his studies, and he spent a lot of his time visiting pubs, brothels in the seedier parts of Edinburgh. Now, this isn't the kind of place which Victorian gentlemen were expected to be seen, and so such visits were, not surprisingly, hidden. And it's this duality of respectability and sordidness of appearance and reality that play out in the character of Jekyll and Hyde. Robert Louis Stevenson also gave up on his studies in the end and told his parents that he wished to be a writer. And they weren't particularly happy with that, but they accepted his decision. Something that made them a bit more unhappy was the fact that he declared himself to be an atheist. Now, both his parents were deeply religious. In fact, his mother's father had been a clergyman, and both his parents said that it was the worst thing that had ever happened to them. So this must have weighed terribly on Robert Louis Stevenson's mind, the fact that he'd upset his parents so much. Things did improve a few years later, because in 1880 he married Fanny Osborne, who was an American, and she often read his early drafts of his manuscripts and gave him useful feedback. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I'm just going to change the page of my notes. Let's scroll down. So, Robert Louis Stevenson's first novel that he had published was Treasure Island, and that was published in 1883. And it was a tremendous success, and pretty much every pirate novel and play and film since there owes a debt to some extent to Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. In fact, pirates as we think of them today generally come originally from that source. He basically invented the genre. So it was, it's an amazingly successful book. And he made a lot of money out of that book, and it brought with it, fame and fortune. Now, as I've said, Robert Louis Stevenson was frequently ill, and it was in the early 1880s he moved to Bournemouth on the south coast of England, where it was hoped the sea air would do him good. And it was while he was in Bournemouth that he suffered a fever. And one night he was having a disturbing dream, and his wife rushed in and woke him. But instead of being grateful for being woken up out of a nightmare, Stevenson said, "Why did you wake me? I was dreaming a fine bogey tale." And it was this dream that supplied him with certain key scenes, like the trampling scene and the famous transformation scene, that would eventually appear in Jekyll and Hyde. Stevenson wrote the novel in just 3 days, or so it's said, and he gave a draft of this first draft to his wife to read. and she was very concerned with the content of the novel and wasn't sure it would be publishable, that publishers would accept it, I think due to obscenity laws. And on this basis, Robert Louis Stevenson threw the manuscript into the fire. Now, his wife had also suggested that he write it more like an allegory rather than a straightforward tale, and he took that on board as well and rewrote the story. The novel drew extensively on Stevenson's knowledge of the unconscious, based on psychological theories of the time. He was very much into psychology and read extensively on the subject. And it also drew on real people. For instance, Deacon Brodie, who was a respected cabinet maker, so a respectable person by day, but who also maintained a secret life as a housebreaker, basically a burglar. And then there was an even more sinister person called Eugene Chantrelle, a man Stevenson had met. And while Chantrelle was a gentleman to all appearances, in reality he was a wife-beater who eventually murdered his wife and was executed for the crime. So Stevenson drew on these things and other things when writing Jekyll and Hyde. Stevenson also said, I think in letters that he wrote, that as a child, one day when suffering from a fever, he became aware that he had two personalities, and he referred to them as myself and the other fellow. Now, remembering also that he frequented brothels in his youth, we can see that Jekyll and Hyde is not a novel that's divorced from its author, but a book that reflects both the duality and many other darker aspects of its author. So, thanks for watching, and please do subscribe.